Okay, so let's see. Just as a note, I mean, most people I think already knew this, but just in case someone didn't get it or probably forgot to mention it. You're not going to be able to upload your project stuff into the folder. For some reason, it was stuttering and starting in terms of letting people in and not. So just send me the files or the folder, and I'll put it in for you. Everyone's going to be in there, so I think you can actually see the ones that are there. But if you try to put yours in, it won't happen. So just don't bother trying this like banging your head on a wall. Just send it to me via emails, attachments, and I'll put it in for you, or through Canvas. Either way works. Let's see what else. Well, just as a note, because someone asked yesterday, I was sort of shocked. There is no final in this class. I know that really bums people out. But if you want to, you guys can collectively make a final for each other. But I don't want to read it. I don't want to do it. So you guys have got your other work to do. Let's see. I think that's it. Hopefully over the break, Candace and I will be able to start organizing the information from the project this semester and also the stuff that I'm doing on Land Court Awards. As we do, we'll post that up. So if you're interested in the project and stuff, you check that website link. You should be able to see what's ongoing. I don't have time now, but once the semester quiets down, I'll start updating the stuff on the website. And be warned, your guys' names won't be attached to the stuff that you sent in. So, or you can get creds or something, one way or the other. Okay, Southeast Asians, the last of our groups. And Noah's asking a little bit about this. And you have to remember that when you're looking at Southeast Asia, Southeast Asia is like when you talk about the Philippines, but of course even more so. What you're talking about is an incredibly complicated place. I have no idea how many different languages there are. I know there's over 46 languages in Vietnam. I have no idea how many there would be in Myanmar, but I'm sure it's got to be a gazillion. Maybe not quite a gazillion, but certainly a lot. All these countries are very, very diverse. They're very, very complicated. Indonesia is probably the most diverse. Well, yeah, I don't know. What do you want to? I'll skip that. So these incredibly diverse places, there's just multiple cultures, multiple languages, and they just end up in the spot. Now, the problem that you have is when Southeast Asia sort of gets defined in the last 500 or 600 years, it's largely through the Chinese. The Chinese are intensely interested in Southeast Asia as an area for resources, especially stuff they've wiped out in China, sandalwood being the most famous. So the Chinese, by the 900 AD, in other words, about 1100, 1200 years ago, are already invading and taking over parts of Southeast Asia to put under Chinese control. Under the Mongols, they take over almost all of Vietnam and the side of the thing. I can't remember where else they took over. Anyways, they take over a large part of that territory and get their butt kicked and thrown back out. And then they come back into the Song dynasty. So the Chinese are constantly messing with this area. And under the Qing dynasty, the 1600 to 1900 dynasty, they basically take over large parts of Southeast Asia and put them under Chinese control. So you don't have any history in this area of countries. What you had is little kingdoms that would do their own thing, that would have a chunk of territory that maybe in a few cases sort of looks like something now, but it really wasn't based on the same logic. They were classic kingdoms. In that regard, it's very similar to India. You got this huge piece of physical real estate, but what you got almost looks like a monopoly set in terms of all the different players. And they're constantly competing. One guy's beating up another one, and someone comes to power and falls down, etc. And so in this vacuum or this sort of disturbance, the Chinese government comes in and pretty much sets up shop and starts getting what it wants to out of the region. Now, in this period of Chinese interference or movement into Southeast Asia, you end up with large numbers of Chinese migrants moving to Southeast Asia. And this is actually key to what we want to look at. So you end up with large Chinese populations, largely from Fujian province and Guangdong province, because those are your maritime provinces, and also Hainan Island, moving down to Southeast Asia. In some cases, this was actually at the gunpoint of their own government. So for example, in the Song and the Ming dynasties, they would actually take whole villages from China and literally at spear point, throw them on a boat and just haul their ass down to somewhere in Vietnam and just say, congratulations, just set up shop. They'd chase all the locals out of a town, for example, and give it to these two Chinese migrants and tell the Chinese guys, have a good time. If you try to go home, we'll kill you. So the Chinese government was intentionally putting Chinese in Southeast Asia on the coastal regions, basically to give themselves sort of cultural control, and also very cynically figuring if they put the Chinese in there, that the Chinese migrants would have to be pro-Chinese, because the minute the Chinese government left, the locals would kill them and throw them out. And it's a very cynical way of doing it. So it's very typical of Chinese foreign policy. It's the same thing going on in Xinjiang right now, Western China and Tibet. The same type of stunt where you move Han Chinese in with the idea the locals will hate them, but the Han Chinese then by definition have to be supporters of the government because otherwise they're dead. We call this balkanization in geography. So the Chinese set this up, and what they do then is they channel all the trade in terms of coastal trade up and down through Southeast Asia and China through these populations of Chinese in these coastal areas throughout Southeast Asia. And so despite the fact they've got all these towns, there's very few locals in the towns. It's Chinese dealing with Chinese that just happen to be somewhere else on the planet. Now, by the 18th and especially the 19th century, the Qing dynasty is falling apart. It's just a screwed up group of people. And the result of that is the Chinese are falling apart, which also have, of course, is the expansion of the Europeans moving through this whole region. And so the Europeans, first the Portuguese and the Spanish, and then the Dutch, and then the British and the French, and everyone else and his brother come into this region and basically take over these Chinese areas, especially these coastal areas. So if you're Vietnamese or Malaysian or something like that, one minute you have the Chinese stomping around, the Chinese bring in immigrants and set up shop and then pretty much, enslave you or ignore you, whichever the case might be. And all of a sudden, bang, one day, and we'll say if it's Vietnamese, all of a sudden the French come in and say, congratulations, we've taken over from the Qing, we're now your new bosses. So what happens is, unlike China, all of Southeast Asia becomes colonized. The vast majority of the island region becomes Dutch, well, actually becomes Portuguese, and the Dutch take it from them. Though the Portuguese keep, for example, Macau in China. And then the French come in and take a lot of the mainland area, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and that becomes French Indochine or French Indochina. And the British come in and take the more western region, Malaysia, down to Singapore, and then up through Myanmar, which used to be called Burma. And so what happens, this all gets divvied up just like a pumpkin pie for Thanksgiving. People just take out chunks. No one has any interest in local populations. No one has any interest in the local history. In fact, in most cases, they don't bother even looking at the local history for another 200 years, maybe. And so, by the mid-late 19th century, all this area now has boundaries, but they're French boundaries drawn against British boundaries, drawn against Dutch boundaries. They have absolutely nothing to do with the physical locations of places or the people that live there or anything. They're entirely arbitrary. And they're entirely designed by folks sitting in London, Paris, and I suppose Rotterdam or something like that. And then that becomes Southeast Asia. Now, of course, this is just a recipe for disaster because your Europeans, unlike your Chinese, are very small in numbers. They are like the Chinese, are just trying to exploit the place for resources. So they turn Malaysia into the world's largest series of rubber plantations, for example, for tires and all the other things you need, non-synthetic or rubber for raincoats. And so, this whole area gets basically turned into basically exploited colonial areas. In fact, it becomes, and oftentimes if you teach a class in geography, Southeast Asia is the area you actually talk about when you want a stereotype of what does a colonial system look like. In its most sort of crystal clear, uncomplicated version, it's Southeast Asia. Now, all this sort of putters along. The local population is, just ignored. And then also in the 20th century, this all radically changes. The first radical change is that populations start to look around and try to figure out why are the French telling us what to do, or why are the Dutch trying to tell us what to do. The Japanese come in and they're the big destabilizers. The Japanese from the late 19th century, but especially by about 1905, 1906, right after the Russo-Japanese War, come up with this idea that what they want to do is they want to access the resources in Southeast Asia. So they come up with this really clever political campaign where they present themselves as the liberator of Asians from European colonialism, which is sort of cynical because, of course, they just, as you remember earlier, they're just taking over Okinawa, or they're taking over Okinawa, or they're going to take over Korea, or they're going to take over Manchuria, and they're going to turn basically into slave states. But the way they're PRing themselves to Asians is they're going to rescue you from the European colonial control. And so they set up what's called the Greater East, I can remember this, the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, which is sort of up there with a Compact of Free Association in terms of a really clever title. It doesn't really mean a hell of a lot. So when the Japanese start World War II in technically 1931, but 1937 is World War II really starts in Asia when they totally invade China. And at that point, what they do is they start hitting up these Southeast Asian groups and start saying, we'll provide you with military support, political support, and something if you overthrow your colonial overlords. Then when the Japanese invade Southeast Asia in 1941, when they go after the Dutch, the British, the Americans, etc., then basically they have a fair amount of support in a lot of these areas from the local population who want to see the Europeans out. And so what you get is the Japanese come in and present themselves as the liberator of Southeast Asia from the the European powers. And that spins fairly well till about 6 or 9 months in, at which point the Japanese propensity for being incredibly ethnocentric and also just, treating these populations basically as dirt, suddenly sinks into everyone's mind. They realize they've traded the French or the British for this nightmare. And that becomes the reality of sort of the World War II period. So, World War II ends, the Japanese are thrown out. But what the Japanese had set up is this dissatisfaction with colonialism and the fact that there were alternatives. And so even though the Japanese are gone, they've left an itch behind. And so when the Japanese leave, in many cases, they intentionally make sure that the weapons, tanks, or whatever they have left at the end of World War II, they leave that with the populations that sort of backed them, or at least didn't fight them directly. And so when World War II ends and the Europeans, the Dutch come in, the British come back, the French come back, all of a sudden they find these populations who have all of a sudden really become with a boatload of attitude. Now the buggers are armed. And so what you end up is the classic colonial, post-World War II colonial wars in Southeast Asia, the Dutch in Indonesia, the French in Southeast Asia, the British in Malaysia, the real brutal, what was called the emergency campaign or something like that. Burma, Myanmar, and other ugly, every one of these areas went through these really ugly episodes of basically, sort of cleaning out the colonial masters. But then the problem they had is when they tried to set themselves up as countries, they don't have any history of cultural boundaries. It's not like Koreans and Chinese, where pretty much you got Chinese over here and Koreans over here. So once you set up the countries, everyone has a pretty clear idea, it's exactly who's on what side of the fence. In Southeast Asia, you don't have that. Vietnamese spill all the way over down into here and also way up into China, but your mountain populations, including the Hmong, are entirely separate from the Chinese, and they spill over into Cambodia. And then you've got the ethnic Cambodians who are also in Laos. It's just, it's just a zoo. People are all over the place. And so when they set up these boundaries, there's a bunch of people on the wrong side of each fence. And so you end up with even more conflict than internally. Some of the places like the French just refuse to give up control. The British eventually sort of back out and then rather cynically made Singapore a country, which is real clever. And then the French just keep it up. The French won't let it go. The Dutch have a really brutal, incredibly nasty campaign with the ethnic Indonesian population or the Indonesian groups, and eventually just get bled white and they give up. The French then spin the whole idea of independence in Southeast Asia into a pro-communist thing, which there was a little bit of truth to in the sense that China was fiddling with the whole thing, because again, China saw Southeast Asia, as it has for the last 600 or 800 years, as a potential resource area. And also the Chinese just figured rather cynically, the more you stirred up the Americans and the colonial powers in Europe, the less people would worry about China. So you end up with basically the Cold War getting drawn into this whole mess. The Americans get sucked in, as you're probably well aware, into Vietnam. Initially, for some bizarre reason, supporting the French. I'm not sure how that worked. But then eventually supporting the dictatorship in South Vietnam against the dictatorship in North Vietnam, very much like the Korea scenario. And then, of course, that segues into the Vietnam War. And when the dust finally settles and you start stacking up and counting the bodies, it's now the 1980s, and this entire area has been pretty much nuked. And everyone hates everyone else, and everyone's got a gun loaded and aimed at everyone else because you killed my cousin, well, you burned my family, and you destroyed my village, and you this. Everyone had a long list of legitimate reasons why they should shoot each other. And it took a really long time for the area to calm down. And in many cases, it was basically because people just ran out of people and guns, or more accurately, people and ammunition. There's still tons of groups running around Southeast Asia with advanced weapons and all sorts of stuff like that that'll shoot anyone for 15 cents. So it's a very destabilized area even now. And you can see it's the current troubles that Thailand's having. It's just become real surreal in the last 6 months. So this is Southeast Asia. Now in this whole mix, there's only two things that everyone can agree on. One is they hate the colonial powers, and two, of course, they hate the first colonial power. Because you have to remember that back, hundreds of years earlier, the Chinese had imported, at literally, gunpoint, thousands of Chinese and placed them all along these coastal areas in Southeast Asia. And what happens with that is since the Chinese will only do deals with the other Chinese, is if you want to have anything to do with money, if you want to deal with any sort of trade or anything like that, you have to deal with the ethnic Chinese, and whether it be in Cambodia or Vietnam or Malaysia or whatever. The ethnic Chinese basically become really wealthy, and they run the system because they're the ones controlling all the traffic and the commerce. The Europeans come in and they find it a lot easier to deal with these ethnic Chinese because they've already dealt with Chinese and it makes a lot more sense, and it's pretty organized and everyone knows what the game is. So they pretty much keep the system intact in the same way the Americans take over the Philippines and pretty much leave the Spanish system untouched. So the Europeans come in, they just want to make a lot of money. So whatever line of least resistance and lowest cost is it, and that's basically dealing with ethnic Chinese. So by the World War II, post-World War II period, what you've got is local populations all through this region that have basically, they're still under colonial power. And with World War II ending, now they're thinking they can get independence. But the other group they really intentionally just enormously dislike are the ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia. Now, one of the reasons, and this makes this area really interesting when you compare it to here, because if you remember back way at the early part of the semester, the Chinese come over here and very quickly intermarry with the other groups. And now your classic stereotype would be Portuguese, Chinese, Hawaiian, for example. In Southeast Asia, they don't do that. And a lot of your areas, for example, the large coastal populations around Ho Chi Minh City that are Chinese there have been there for 500 years. They still speak Cantonese or Fukienese. They still till recently imported brides down from China to marry. And so they were all bilingual, but their home language was from China. They never actually incorporated into Vietnamese society. They never married Vietnamese, and they just used Vietnamese as servants. So when the colonial powers are thrown out, when you throw out the French, for example, in Vietnam, the other group that's on the list the Vietnamese want their ass out of Vietnam is these ethnic Chinese, because they've been there for hundreds of years. They've constantly controlled and, in some cases enslaved and generally beat down the local populations. And they've gone to great lengths to make sure that they stay distinct. And, if you suddenly have a gun in your arms and you get rid of anyone you don't like, the guy who spent a couple hundred years saying that basically you're dirt and he's better, he's going to be your first target. And so what happens is these places get independence. One of the first groups they hunt down are the ethnic Chinese, and they want their ass out of there. Now, that's where Singapore comes in, for example. In Malaysia, the Malays, which are your largest ethnic group in Malaysia, they just hate the Chinese. And so the Chinese, by 1947, 48, 49, when the British are getting ready to leave, the Chinese aren't stupid. They know this is going to happen, so they intentionally move almost en masse down to the huge port city of Singapore, and then declare it independent because they can't get guarantees from the Malaysian country that they'll treat the Singapore Chinese as co-citizens. So the folks in Singapore basically just give them the middle finger and say, it's been nice knowing you guys, we're going to be an independent country, which they still are. So that's where Singapore comes in. Singapore is actually an enclave of ethnic Chinese that are actually populations that have been in that area for 400, 500, 600 years. But many of them aren't originally from Singapore. They're basically refugees that moved down there in the 40s and 50s. The folks in Vietnam, for example, don't have that option. They very not surprisingly, they align themselves with the Americans, which turns out to be a bad idea. And when the Vietnam War ends and basically our wars in Southeast Asia sort of filter out or collapse one after the other, there's large numbers of ethnic Chinese that are in absolute panic because basically their butts have got a bullseye taped to them. And they've got no sympathy and no support. If you're ethnic Vietnamese and you go into a Vietnamese re-education camp, you might come out. If you're ethnic Chinese, you're going to disappear after a couple of weeks and you're just buried somewhere. So ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia suddenly find that the bell rings in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s as these places gain independence. The fighting shoots down between the different ethnic groups in the area. And they sort of stabilize their borders. That's pretty sketchy even now. And then everyone thinks, hey, wait a second, let's go after the Chinese. Because what they want is they want the resources, they want everything, but it's also a vendetta for the way the Chinese have treated them as being ethnically superior for hundreds of years. So when you look at the Chinese here, or I should say when you look at the Southeast Asians here, a lot of those folks, though they might be Thai or Vietnamese or something like that, if you actually talk to them to find out the family originally came from one of these areas and was actually, in many cases, are actually ethnic Chinese. They don't necessarily look any different, because there's been intermarriage despite the fact they weren't supposed to. But a lot of the Chinese here that you see in Honolulu or in Hawaii in the 21st century are actually ethnic Chinese from Southeast Asia. So it's very typical in Chinatown. This is where you find like the lady we used to get juice from until she moved out. She's ethnic Vietnamese, speaks Mandarin, speaks Vietnamese, speaks Thai, speaks Cantonese, English. I don't know. She's got one other language. I can't remember what it is. And that's just sort of typical for this area. That was how the ethnic Chinese survived in Southeast Asia. They were the entrepreneurs and they controlled the banking and financial sector. And they paid the price for it in the 20th century. So what happens is this group has to get out of town. Now you have to remember a big part of this then is they're leaving literally with guys with guns and bayonets chasing them down the street. So when they get out, as individuals, they get out as maybe parts of families, their villages are burned, their houses are destroyed. A lot of their family members are literally shot in front of them. So they get out of here and they're the classic refugee. So they come over here, and in many cases, the Americans, as sort of a atonement for the messes of the Vietnam War, the Americans have to handle these, what we're usually called boat people, because many of them basically evacuate this area in small boats, and then just go offshore hoping someone will rescue them. And the vast majority of them end up in the United States because the Americans feel some obligation for the political destabilization we were involved in. And so what these folks come over is they don't come as coherent families. They're not under contract. They have no interest in coming to the United States. They just literally are leaving literally in one step in front of a lynch mob. And this makes an enormous difference because refugees can't be treated as migrants. Refugees are an entirely different animal than a migrant. A migrant sees themselves as someone who still has home. They're maybe sending money back home, or something like that. There's still a home and a family that might be distant from them, but they're still an operating unit, and they still see a relationship. That's entirely different than some, 15-year-old girl who's seen her parents bayoneted in front of her house destroyed, her village destroyed, and she's the only member of the family that gets away. And she's got nothing left. Her entire world's vanished. It's just like everything just ceased to exist. And so when she gets on a boat and the Americans simply drop her off somewhere in the United States, she's a nightmare. Refugees are an absolute nightmare to work with, simply because they're in many cases still so shocked and still tied up in the world that was destroyed that they left, that especially the older folks just bring you to tears because all they can talk about is when they were growing up and the people they used to know, and it's like, oh, uncle's so cute. Oh, wait, no, uncle's dead. They just talk about this world that doesn't exist anymore. It's a fantasy world pre-1980s. And it's very hard for them to move on because everyone and everything that meant anything to them is dead and gone. Or even worse, they don't know. So that's what refugees are. And refugees, this is the big refugee population that hits. And it's one of the reasons why on the mainland you find that, especially in the West Coast, especially in like Seattle also, but especially in California, you find really almost kamikaze type Vietnamese gangs still. That's because even second, third generation, they don't really feel any relationship to the United States, because the United States, as far as they're concerned, was one of the major factors in why their family got killed. It was the United States in Vietnam or whatever they're thinking of that basically led to that happening. If the United States hadn't been there, it wouldn't have happened. And of course, yet the United States rescued him, but then the United States, in many cases, really didn't know what to do with him, because you have to remember at the end of the Vietnam War, unlike the war since then, there was a huge amount of opposition won to the war by the time it ended. And if you were in the war, you, in many cases, would come back and have people literally throw shit at you and just, hated you for having been in there, despite the fact the vast majority of people were drafted. So, the Vietnam War was a war Americans wanted to hate and wanted to forget. And so if you also end up with a whole pile of refugees standing around trying to figure out what to do, absolutely everyone's going to just dump on their ass, because they become the standing icon for a war that just led to a bunch of people dying for what, as far as Americans were concerned, had no purpose and had no end to it. And so, if you're refugees from that area, you've got every possible thing stacked up against you, in the sense that no one wants to see you. Your very presence reminds them of missing relatives or a world that, et cetera. And of course, no one's interested in your problems. So the refugees from Southeast Asia coming over here, in many ways probably face the most aggressive dislike and hatred of any of the groups that I would say ever came to the United States, because none of the other groups were ever set up in the situation of coming over right after a staggeringly bloody war that huge numbers of Americans died or were wounded or messed up in. And these folks become sort of the symbol of everything that everyone wants to forget. In the sense that even today, the Vietnam War is something that people generally don't talk about, don't want to talk about, and try to avoid almost any sort of discussion of it. Everyone talks about the heroes of World War II. You don't see any discussion like that about Vietnamese in terms of folks in the Vietnam War. So coming from that area and being part of that conflict, you do everything you can to not be associated with it, because there's absolutely no positive side to it. But if you're a refugee, you're totally hung up with it. because that's your world that disappeared. And you know, it'd be very weird if you're a refugee from, say, Vietnam. If you ever want to see this, go watch Apocalypse Now, that really famous movie from a million years ago. If you're a Vietnamese refugee and you end up in some place like, I don't know, well, as we'll get into it, in say Dayton, Ohio, you suddenly look around and, you know, these are the same Americans you saw walking down the streets of what used to be called Saigon. But they're also in many cases the same guys you saw coming over as military units shooting up villages around you or something like chasing Viet Cong and such like that. You know, so you see the Americans as possibly some of the folks that actually killed part of your family. Now at a later date, those same Americans then rescue you and plop you down, and now you're an individual, that 15-year-old girl standing in Dayton, Ohio, trying to figure out what you do in a world that, if they're not your enemies, they're sure not your friends. You know, yeah, that's one reason why you don't see people taking in all the refugees in Thailand. No one knows what to do with them. So that's refugees. Now, the bizarre part that gets very much in the Hawaii episode is the fact that these refugees, you know, the State Department, DOD brings these refugees in, the State Department brings them in, and then, of course, has to resettle them. And because of pressure from the Western states, specifically Washington State and California, who were real aggressive, they didn't want large numbers of Southeast Asian refugees. They said, we already have large Asian populations. This is going to end up in a lot of violence from folks that basically see, you know, this new wave of, you know, takeover. And you got to remember, Yellow Peril was really alive and strong during the Vietnam War period. So, you know, especially in the West Coast, they said, no, we've already paid our dues, we've already got Asian groups. You find someplace else to put them. And for some reason in the State Department, who of course saw these folks as basically being an embarrassment, just wanted them out of sight, what they decided to do is they resettled most of them in the Midwest and the South. So for example, they settled thousands of them in Galveston, Texas. I have no idea why. They settled, I believe, was over 2,000 in Dayton, Ohio, where our sister school is. You know, in Dayton, Ohio, at that time in the 70s and 80s was just a classic white enclave. You know, there was an African-American population there, pretty much folks in one neighborhood or folks that went to, say, UD or something like that. But the huge majority of the population was second, third, you know, fifth or sixth generation, you know, Anglo-American, originally of Dutch or Swedish heritage or German heritage that moved into that part of Ohio. And all of a sudden, kerflop, you just dump a couple of thousand, you know, Southeast Asian, largely Vietnamese and Cambodian refugees, just kerplop in this town. You give them some money, you set them up so they've got some sort of a stipend for housing. You give them access to, you know, the different like food support and stuff like that. And you basically pat them on the back and say, been nice knowing you guys, come on, be a success. Remember what it says on the Statue of Liberty. And the State Department just leaves them there. And the state of Ohio sort of like, what? You know, and the folks in Dayton are like, what? And these refugees are like, what? I mean, everyone's like, you know, no one has a clue. And the federal government just basically washes their hand of the whole thing. It sounds sort of like Micronesians here in the state of Hawaii now. Federal government sets it up and they're gone. And so what happens is not surprising that it works out really poorly. A lot of these groups find themselves immediately targeted. The economic reality, especially in places like Ohio, especially in Dayton, Ohio at the time, is the auto industry had collapsed. So, you know, unemployment was really, really high. And so what you had was high unemployment, and also a group of refugees who are partially supported by the US government comes in. And absolutely everyone gets on their ass. Everyone wants them out. And of course, the refugees, given the fact they don't have anything left, can be pretty aggro in terms of the response back because they figure, shit, we got nothing to lose. We got to fight for our lives. And so this really, really just unravels incredibly quickly. And so what happens is these groups then start to coalesce. So they were sending like 500 to here and maybe like 800 to Des Moines, Iowa, and they were just scattering them all over the place. I guess with the idea that if you dispersed them somehow, it would work out better. What you just end up with these, because they weren't dispersing families, they literally would just grab 500 people that came off of a couple of boats, put them in one town, 300 people, put them in another town. So there was no attempt to try to organize this by village, by even what ethnic group they were, or anything. It was just really typical federal government. You know, they just sort of throw things in a box and then just toss the box out the window somewhere. So the end result is these groups start to finally contact each other. They start to sort of coalesce, figuring that there's safety in numbers. And of course, they'll have a shared experience. And what happens is most of them move out of the Midwest. I happened to, once we were doing work in Dayton and with our sister school, and I bumped into this guy who was pretty obviously Vietnamese. Turned out he was actually Hmong. And I asked him, and he said, yeah, you know, he's one of the 4 families left in Dayton, Ohio. They'd set up one Vietnamese restaurant, but they tried to set up some of the Vietnamese restaurants, but the folks in Ohio wouldn't eat Vietnamese food, not because they didn't like it, but because at least in the 80s and 90s, they didn't want to be reminded of Vietnam. So if you could call it something else, you might get them to eat it, but they didn't want pho. They didn't want to be reminded of the people that made pho. So that meant that basically everyone had to leave. They couldn't get jobs. They couldn't find a way to make a living. So a large proportion of them moved into the coastal areas. Ironically, ended up at the West Coast because, that's where there were more Asians. Large number moved into, for example, New York, same reason. So there's a lot of secondary migration from the original placement. Now, the minute they moved out from the areas they've been placed, then they lost all federal assistance. So if they moved to someone like New York, then, the federal government didn't, sort of the federal government answered, we put you in Des Moines, Iowa. If you want to go somewhere else, that's good, but don't expect anything else from us. You're only going to get support as long as you stay in Des Moines, Iowa. So they moved to these areas, and of course, then they end up with a very much at the bottom end of the feeding chain, because in many cases they have very little, if any, English. They weren't motivated to be here. They have incredibly limited skill sets in many cases. But most importantly, they're just sort of messed up emotionally. They're just basket cases in many cases. So when they move into the cities, they're the bottom end of the feeding chain. So not surprisingly, a lot of these groups, the Vietnamese are most famous for this, basically start up criminal organizations. And in some ways, they would actually probably see them as revolutionary organizations to fight back against the Americans who had messed their lives up in so many ways, as far as they're concerned. And this is one reason why the Vietnamese gangs, even today, are considered real kamikazes, because they just don't give a shit. They don't see the society that they're in as anything that they owes them anything, or they owe it anything. So they're just, they'll go completely off. But for a lot of the rest of the population, the ones that don't want to get into something like that, they didn't have to figure out where to go. And of course, the cities have the advantage. You can start Vietnamese restaurants or, Chinese restaurants. Huge proportion of Chinese restaurants, even here, are actually Southeast Asian refugees. Because in most cases, they know how to cook those type of dishes, and they know Americans don't know anyways. So basically, in a lot of the mainland United States, you can see a Chinese or a Thai or some other type of restaurant. It's very likely that the folks are part of this refugee population. So they move into those type of industries where basically, again, they don't have to compete with the rest of the population. The folks that moved down into Galveston, that area there, were actually set up by the government for fishing. Again, the State Department's attitude is, we rescued you off of a boat, therefore you must be familiar with boats and you must be a fisherman. So we'll give you access to some cheap boats we bought for you, and you can go fish. And of course, the vast majority of these folks lived in towns. They had no idea what a boat was, except there was a pointy end to it. They'd been rescued from one. So they find themselves suddenly in the fishing industry. The fishing industry in that part of time in the Gulf was collapsing again. There were new regulations. The Vietnamese get into this, or I should say Southeast Asians, largely Vietnamese, get into the fishing industry. Immediately gets really ugly. The local fishermen organize against them, firebomb some boats, kill a bunch of people. The Vietnamese respond back, firebombing some of the local boats. The feds, the amphibies come in, and the whole thing just degenerates into this insane asylum. And all of a sudden, one day, the Vietnamese just say, we're out of here. And they just lock, stock, and barrel, I believe, like 5,000 or 6,000, just only pack up in the space of a couple of weeks. They're just gone. And it says something that no one at the federal level is even interested in where they go. So like, oh, good, this problem's gone. And so what happened is they relocated in Monterey, California, because there were some other relatives and folks there that were saying this isn't as bad there. It hadn't been as long as you had 5 or 6 Vietnamese fishing boats. The minute you've got 5,000 or 6,000 Vietnamese all show up and they all want to get in the fishing industry, again, your local fishermen get really upset. The state of California puts in very special regulations that target Vietnamese with fishing boats to make sure they can't go fishing. Very typical of California legal policy, which on one hand looks liberal, on the other hand is very good at hammering minorities they don't want to have around. If you remember that video about the Chinese, 100 years before this. So they go, basically they get targeted there. And then all of a sudden one day, they just sort of collectively decide we've had enough of this. And they'd heard about the fact that in Hawaii, there wasn't the same type of attitude about them. In Hawaii, since the majority population was Asian in one way, shape, or form, they didn't stick out. They weren't a visible minority. And even though a large proportion of the population here was involved in the Vietnam War in one way, shape, or form, of course, you have Tripler and, the whole mess here. On the other hand, the attitude towards Asians was really different, and there wasn't the same huge amount of animosity about someone who was from that area. They didn't see them as like a stereotype of a war they didn't want to remember. So that group's moves over here pretty much en masse. And I was actually had my first boat back then, and all of a sudden one day there was this open call on channel 16, which is the open channel from the Coast Guard, asking any boats that are out or can go out south of the island of Oahu and look for a bunch of boats. And we went out, we didn't see anything, but one of my friends was out there, and sure enough, they in the Coast Guard found this whole huge armada of Vietnamese fishing boats, or fishing boats with Vietnamese in them, that had left Monterey about 2 or 3 weeks earlier. Many of them were little tiny things that, and they just literally piled them full of gas cans, threw the whole family in there and the dog and everything else. They were actually using one chart and 2 National Geographic paper maps to get from California to Hawaii. No one's ever figured out how they actually did it. They should have just disappeared in the Pacific Ocean. But they pretty much all made it over here. And in fact, some of those boats were still, till about 10 years ago, some of those boats were tied at Pier 21, where you see the fishing boats when you go around the curve at Evelay. A lot of those were actually the Vietnamese, they were the Monterey boats that came over here in the Vietnamese boat migration here in the 1980s. So a large part of the population from Southeast Asia is first placed on the mainland all over the place by the federal government, coalesces in communities, especially originally in Texas, and then they get out of Texas, move to the West Coast. And a large number of them ever since then, even down till today, have been moving slowly to Hawaii as the last refuge where they can just sort of be themselves, and there's no stereotype, and they don't have to deal with the issues. And there's no political repercussions about the fact that their family was from Vietnam. Here it's like, okay, so what? In California, that still has political connotations if you're running for office. People will still use that against you. So what you find here is in a very interesting way, this group actually sees Hawaii as being a place that's more accepting of them being invisible. Because this isn't a group that's really aggro on identity. They're not really big on keeping their Vietnamese identity or their Cambodian identity. They just want a place where basically people won't diss in their parade. And so in disappearing into an Asian majority population is fine with them. Now, the thing that's interesting about this, you have to remember, this is occurring simultaneously with the Samoans, Tongans. And it's just at the start of the ever expanding wave of folks in from Micronesia here. So these three groups are all coming here roughly at the same time, within 5 or 10 year period. In fact, Southeast Asians are still one of the largest groups to Hawaii, especially in resettlement from the mainland United States. So you still see large numbers of Southeast Asians coming to Hawaii because they can't handle the lack of tolerance in the US mainland. And the scary thing, of course, in the 21st century is, no one at the age of 60 is going to remember the Vietnam War. People now are just intolerant because they're Asian. So this group has come over here. They've done very, very well for themselves here. About 2/3 of the restaurants in this part of town are all Vietnamese, originally Vietnamese or Southeast Asian refugees. Now some of them are Southeast Asian migrants because ironically they have done well enough here that what you find is that that's become attractive to populations who have relatives in Southeast Asia that want to get out for some reason. So the more recent move of a fair number of Thai over here in the last 10 or 15 years, invariably is because they know someone who is a refugee from that area who finally recontacted family back in, say, Thailand or something like that and said, hey, this was a nightmare in the mainland United States, but Hawaii is actually pretty good. So it's really interesting when you look at these three groups, your Polynesians, your Micronesians, your Southeast Asians, they're all dealing with the same group that you would call local that's here. But their attitude about this place and the people that live here is entirely different. And that I think it has to do more, not so much from where they're from, but the situation that they were in when they arrived here. This group had no expectations, and in many cases, they already had the crap beat out of them in various situations in the US mainland where state governments and everyone pretty much did everything to throw them out. Remember that Japanese American video, no Japanese wanted here. That's how you actually saw signs like that in the 70s and 80s from what I hear in the US and the mainland. No Vietnamese wanted here, no Asians in around here, and what they meant as Southeast Asians. So the United States mainland, as far as I'm concerned, has never changed. It pretends it's become more accommodating, but I don't find any evidence to that. And your Southeast Asians here would second that, I'm sure, almost to a person. They find the U.S. mainland to still be rabidly racist, and very anti-Asian. What you find that's interesting about this, and of course, the classic story you hear from the older folks, is that when they come over here to Hawaii, They then coalesce in their various communities. So if you go back in Waianae Valley in the back, the Malka part of the valley, there's a really large population, it'd be about 200 or 300 now, of Hmong living back there. And they do a lot of the truck farming that you see in the back of Waianae, bok choy and stuff like that. But one of the things they got into when they first came over from the hill areas of Vietnam is they were growing poppies, which are these beautiful, huge, when we were working back there for the Board of Water Supply, we saw these things, fields of these enormous, just fluorescent orange-red flowers. And we just assumed, like the Board of Water Supply guys, we just assumed they were doing this for the cut flower industry. Well, they weren't. These were opium poppies. That's what the Hmong do in Southeast Asia. They're one of the big opium farmers. And what you do is you cut the side of the flower pot or something, and the opium seeps out as a ooze, as a liquid. And then you collect it, and that's raw opium. And so the Hmong were trying to make a few bucks, and and they always have done that in Southeast Asia. No one cared, so they came over here and they turned Waianae on this vast opium farm. Until all of a sudden we were actually there, and all of a sudden there were a bunch of choppers and the fibbies and immigration and drugs and HPD, and everyone comes rappelling down choppers and armed vehicles going to the valley. Arrest a bunch of people, destroy all the opium poppy fields, and then basically let everyone go because it suddenly dawned when they finally started talking to them. These guys didn't realize it was illegal. It's too bad they didn't have another version because, boy, that's a pretty flower. You literally can see it from the front part of Waianae Valley. You can just see it almost like a fluorescent glow in the background. So, so there's our little bit of fame as, the major U.S. growers of opium in the United States were in the back of Waianae for, I guess, about a year. They never actually got a crop out. That's a classic story that the old guys at Board of Water Supply will tell you. So, of course, here the restaurant industry. Huge proportion of restaurants here that are any sort of, whether it be Burmese or Indonesian. Well, I don't know if we have any Indonesian restaurants here. Anyways, Thai, Vietnamese, Chinese, a huge number of those restaurants are actually Southeast Asians. They've moved into small entrepreneurial areas. They're still a fairly large part of the fishing industry. The longline guys here are pretty much all Southeast Asians. Socially, even though they dislike the Chinese intentionally, basically the social pattern, you can just use that part we talked about, Chinese values. Southeast Asian values for our intents and purposes in this class are exactly the same. But they're probably most famous, at least as far as I'm concerned, simply because they're such a striking difference to the other populations coming into Hawaii at the same period, and of course still coming in today. I've never seen a particularly good discussion of the analysis of why the huge discrepancy in terms of attitudes. I have suspicions, but I can't prove them, so I'll just leave them at that. Okay, so let me really quickly segue into the last of the dominant companies here. Okay, when you look at what we have here, there was a bunch of work done in the 80s and 90s when American society was going through one of its multiple guilt trips. I was trying to figure out how everyone here could live well together. What you got was this sort of weird, idea. Well, maybe there's some way to institutionalize people liking each other. This was, this whole idea of political correctness, where you basically, among other things, would basically define. Let's just do this. Would basically set up, well, as long as you, oops, okay. As long as you controlled how people thought about each other, in other words, you could actually institutionalize acceptance. You could train people for acceptance. And not surprisingly, what they did is a lot of researchers, especially in sociology, social psych and stuff like that, looked at Hawaii, where you had a very complex multi-ethnic population that actually tolerated each other. And they thought, wow, okay, what we'll do is we'll figure out what makes this work in Hawaii, then we can actually export it to the mainland, and the United States will live up to its promise of being a tolerant society. And so they came over, and there was a lot of work done, and it was just a total waste of time. And because what they didn't realize, or they should have known, but again, they were looking for sort of this law, this thing you could actually make happen. So it was like a vaccine. They thought you could somehow vaccinate people against intolerance. And so what they didn't realize is there were actually several things that were key. And probably the most central one was the fact that you had Hawaiians as your initial population here, because your Hawaiian population has always been based, in fact, still largely based is on whether your family allegiances are, your family loyalties. They're really massively disinterested in what color you are or where you're from. The vast majority of my family and friends are all basically, married to folks who are different than them. And that's, that never comes up in discussion. No one ever thinks about who someone's married to, who their spouse is. Unlike almost all the other groups where that becomes a real source of angst or, discussion or whatever. All that anyone's concerned about, will he be a good fit for the family? Now you have to remember, since we're under Hawaiian control until 1893, what that meant is the government was totally disinterested when people bring up, oh, you can't let these people in, they're a different group or they're a different, quote, race, unquote. The Hawaiian government was always sort of like, what? Especially by the 1850s, you had so many groups here already, especially because you had the Howleys that come in, 1778. You have small numbers of Chinese coming in, the Alfong family most famously in the late, I think, 1802. You have Marin and his family, the real famous guy from Mexico who's Spanish, who brings in orange trees and stuff, same period. So you had a small group of other types here. By the 1870s, 1880s, of course, you have the massive wave of people coming in during the plantation period. And so when everyone's saying, oh, you can't let the Japanese stay because they're going to pollute this place, the government, Kalakaua and Liliuokalani are sort of looking like, what? What are you talking about? So the fact that there's basically, it isn't until 1898 in many ways that you actually get institutionalized racism coming in the sense that the government's set up in such a way as to make sure that only certain people have access to stuff. And that has a huge impact because what it means is you don't have a history of intolerance based on people's people's physical appearance. You have it based on their loyalty to a set of social values and attitudes, again, that Hawaiian side of the scale, if you want to. And then, of course, the fact that your power elite after that is your missionary boys. And, of course, they're Hapa. So they, too, are a complicated group of people. And so what this means is you then end up with a type of prejudice you do on the U.S. mainland, which, as far as I'm concerned, is still largely based on the color of your skin and what your physical appearance is like. Here, it's going to be much more based, for many of the groups, on what you identify with in terms of what you see yourself as, or the minute you open your mouth, what you sound like. And that's very, very, very different than the mainland. It's not that people here aren't prejudiced, they're just as prejudiced, they're just prejudiced in different ways. And here prejudice tends to be length of stay here and have you paid your dues to be part of the system here. Versus the mainland is no one cares. If you're Chinese and you live outside of San Francisco, they don't care whether your family came over in 1850 for the gold rush. They're still going to crap in your parade because you're Chinese. So it's a very different set of discriminatory devices here. The fact that you never have an clear ethnic majority. You're starting to get one now with mainland Americans, and that's one of the things that really worries me about the investment climate right now. That tends to encourage that. But what you had is you had a very complex place. There never was really a population. Any group that was going to be in charge had to do with the support of another group. So, for example, the Japanese become the Democratic Party in the 1950s and 60s, but they're only able to leverage that to power and get rid of the missionary boy Republican power elite by virtue of aligning with other groups, the local Chinese, local Filipinos, etc. They can't do it on their own. So what you find is here is you have to be part of sort of a multiplicity of groups that are both on occasionally agreeing on stuff, in other cases disagree, etc. You don't have a group that can sort of say, well, we've always run this place, and this is the way it's going to be, so just suck wind and deal with it, which is true of most of the mainland even today, which is why you end up so much political social stress there. All of a sudden, the groups that have been in power since the beginning are suddenly finding themselves under threat, and that doesn't work well. And also, of course, you have the plantation system right into the 1920s that basically forces integration. It forces assimilation. It forces acceptance of the system here because no one has the power to change it. And to a certain extent, of course, also forces intermarriage because the vast majority of folks coming over in the plantation system are single males between 18 and 30 years of age. So if they're going to have a family, it's going to have to be another group because the other groups are already here and they're the ones that have potential spouses. So what it means is for basically almost 80 years, everyone goes through the same system. Everyone's sort of inculcated in how to survive and why, and everyone pretty much has to get by in terms of interacting with each other. But it's important to remember, as I mentioned during the semester, is that what you have here is tolerance. People don't like the other ethnic groups. They tolerate the other ethnic groups. Oftentimes there's a stereotype as, aloha spirit, everyone gets along, but gets along is tolerance. Gets along doesn't mean that you want to be like them. And one of the side effects of all this study that was done in the 80s and 90s about exporting this is when they finally realized that they couldn't do it. You can't export it. The situation in Hawaii is a unique historical situation based on the groups, especially the fact that indigenous population was in charge, which is not true anywhere else in the United States. There's such an, never mind. And so, and then this tremendous ethnic diversity. You don't find one or two groups in charge. You find this real mix. The fact that you had a situation where your power elite that wanted to be the power elite, your missionary boys were always very small in number. So there was never this threat that the new migrants were taking jobs away from the old, established populations, which is hugely the case in the mainland. And so there, what you find is that basically, as long as you don't mess the system up, and as long as you're willing to play by the rules, they would put up with you until you were here long enough to sort of meld into the system. And Filipinos would be the group that most famously has happened in the 20th century, though of course it's not all there. And then of course Samoans, Tongans, I would argue, are the most recent group sort of moving into that. Southeast Asians probably sort of disappeared simply because they just went below the radar and sort of became generically Asian. So what you also have to remember on the mainland, even though you had, sort of benevolent despotism, the big five paternalism of the plantations, on the U.S. mainland, that was always a fairly small part of a much larger complex socioeconomic system of factories, urban centers, etc. Here, it's not the case. Pretty much the plantations, to a lesser extent the ranches, ran this place. So they pretty much, everyone went through that system. If you were part of the elites, you worked on the plantation as management. If you were part of everyone else, you worked on the plantation as grunt workforce. But right into the 1920s, everyone had their time on the plantation. In fact, if you ask your grandparents if you're from here, many of them from Oahu can actually remember when they were in high school actually picking pineapple for dole, which was a big thing to do for folks in the summer, working at the cannery down in Evelay. So even into the 50s, 60s, and I believe into the maybe early 70s, a large part of the lower middle class population here in Honolulu was still involved in the plantation, in this case pineapple. So there was this huge sort of power structure that everyone sort of shared an experience with. Now what that means, of course, is the populations that come over here after the 70s, so that'd be your Polynesians, Micronesians, Southeast Asians, don't participate in that. And that's always made it more difficult for them to become integrated into the community. They don't have that shared experience. And this would also be true of the Filipino population that comes over after World War II, of course, because they're not here as part of that experience either. So some of them do end up in the pineapple industry here, but a large proportion of them just end up here looking for work. And that means that they don't have the work credits, or whatever you want to call it, that allow them to sort of say, well, I paid my dues, I belong here, which is sort of how you get accepted here, is, paying the dues, as it were. I see several things happening. Probably the most striking, because it has the most to do with enormous amounts of change, is the collapse of the various trusts. The Damon Trust is completely collapsed. The Tramble Trust is completely collapsed. I should point out, if you're really interested in legal stuff, both of these trusts, when they collapsed, were actually decided in courts. It's illegal under US law and actually state of Hawaii law, but actually the decisions of the courts have been kept sealed. There's been a number of court cases asking to free those up to see who got what and how it got broken up. They're still stalling. The state judiciary is stalling. They were actually told by the federal government, you have to cough that stuff. They've now been stalling for 20 years, I believe, on the Damon stuff. So fascinating example of just how, if you're a bureaucracy, you can ignore your legal responsibilities. Castle family is going through the final parts of breaking up their trust, which of course is the confusion you see down in Kailua Town in terms of what's going on down there. So what this means is huge parts of what were fairly cohesive land decisions that controlled most of the accessible land in the islands that's not under military control, were these large trusts. And as these trusts are falling apart, and for various reasons, there was some movie about 15 years ago about that, I forget what it was called. I don't know. If I remember, I'll let you guys know. And that's created a huge amount of change, because all of a sudden what that means is the enormous number pieces of property come up for investment. Mapuna Puna was Damon. When the Damon Trust collapsed, large parts of Mapuna Puna were bought up by a consortium of mainland Canadian investors who immediately changed almost everything in terms of how much was being charged, who could be down there, what they wanted to do with the place. And this created a huge amount of instability, especially in rural and urban areas in the islands, as these trusts are breaking up, because for good or bad, it meant that there was a fair amount of continuity in terms of what was going on. That's now gone. This gets very little press here because they can't get access to find out who's doing what, but also because the press here traditionally doesn't make waves. It likes to pretend it's investigative, but its investigations are sort of like the Girl Scouts investigate something. It's not. investigative per se. They don't ask the hard questions. So the trust breaking up is a huge one. What this mainly is doing in many ways is meaning that mainland investment of property ownership is now becoming a really big issue, whereas this wasn't really the case. Property was generally controlled by families, at least in one way or another, were local, since they were the missionary families from the, the Mahele period, the 1850s. So that's how that's going to change this place is hard to tell, but at least so far it's been pretty ugly. The other thing that you're seeing is, of course, with this is the fact that then your Anglo-American or mainland-based population is moving in ever increasing numbers. I think that's going to rapidly increase with the COVID issue, not so much because of COVID, but because if you look at the mainland media, the fear of political and strife and friction and violence is constantly growing. And the stereotype of Hawaii as being paradise means that if you've got the money coming to Hawaii to escape what they see as the social destabilization of the mainland is becoming ever a greater thing. It's one reason why the real estate market here is so tight, even with COVID. And so, what this means is more and more you're finding Anglo-Americans coming over here, originally maybe as second homes, but they're actually staying here. So more and more there's pressure for us to look like the mainland, which is ironic because a lot of these folks are trying to leave the mainland. One of the classic cases, again, if any of you are into judiciary of the law, would be the really fascinating fiasco of the Didi trials. That was the Secret Service agent that sought the guy, and I think it was McDonald's or something in Waikiki. Has gone through, I believe, 3 or 4 trials, which the prosecutor's offices managed to totally F up in a way. I know someone who's one of the deputy prosecutors, and you mentioned that, and no one wants to talk about it, because if you ever go somewhere in the future, the Didi mistrials or miscues by the prosecutor's office are going to be taught in law classes as how not to do something. But what you have here is a case, again, of a mainland person shooting a local person. And initially, there was much the spin that occurred with the Massey case in the 1920s, 1930s, but it very quickly got pulled out in the press here because of the power of tourism. The press here was told, don't present it that way. Otherwise, what you're going to do is, potentially trigger violence against tourists. The same fear, ironically, as the Massey case in the 30s had. I think they're still up for like the 4th retrial. I lost track. You need a spreadsheet to figure it out. But how that case was handled, how it was discussed even here in terms of the media, how it was handled in the mainland in terms of media, if you actually compare that to the media during the Massey case, on one hand, there's some interesting divergences, which isn't surprising. It's 70 years later or something. But on the other hand, there's some really creepy parallels. So if you have a chance and you got free time and you're into law, strongly recommend that you actually look at that case and actually compare it, since you guys have seen the Massey case now. You've got tourism as an economic base here instead of the plantations. One of the things about the plantations is, on one hand, the labor was cheap, it was poorly paid, but also what it meant is there were ways out. The scary thing about the tourism industry is, one, that its service industry pays incredibly poorly. And secondly, it doesn't lead you to a lot of other opportunities. You can be ancillary areas, like someone teaching surfing to tourists, but it's a volume-based industry, and it's not a good stable revenue base, as we've seen with COVID. More importantly, unlike the plantations or anything else, tourism is entirely based on the stereotype of Hawaiians. Tourism here would cease to exist if it wasn't for the stereotype of Hawaiians. And so what you've got is one of your larger ethnic groups here finds itself as the basis for an entire industry for which it basically gets nothing as a group. There's nothing that supports Hawaiians. The tourism industry doesn't pay anything to enhance or restabilize or protect Hawaiian values and attitudes, or even Hawaiian land. So what you get is a multi billion-dollar industry that's done on the back of an ethnic group here, which is one reason why I think in one or two of the things I asked you, where do you see locals versus where do you see Hawaiians and some of that stuff. And what I was trying to get you to see is you don't see locals, because locals are irrelevant to the tourism industry. What the tourism industry wants and needs is Hawaiians. And so this is the Live Aloha bumper or sticker on the back of your car. And that's simply because that's the way that works. And that's just the reality of tourism here. Okay, sure, no problem, kind of. So that's one of the paradoxes you get here. It's this largest industry, which of course now we're trying to massively ramp up, is based on a bunch of ethnic stereotypes, which actually in many ways devalue that population, and yet ironically don't provide any support to that population, which is something that folks like Hanani have been complaining about for 50 years and such. That discussion, sadly enough, has not taken place with COVID. And the one great advantage, as I pointed out in yesterday's class, is one thing that COVID actually gave us. It gave us a timeout for a period of time to see what the impacts of tourism are without the tourism industry making noise. And what I find rather distressing, again, this would be largely the media, is I don't find any sort of conversation going on here about who was actually benefiting from tourism and who wasn't. Yeah, a huge proportion of the population lost jobs here, but a lot of those jobs were basically people working 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet. And tourism is responsible for a lot of that economic scenario in terms of the, both the cost of living here, but also the relative disparity in terms of the work that you put in, the pay that you get. And we've had a period which is now ended to actually look at that and actually discuss, what do you want tourism to be? What is, for example, what does tourism owe Hawaiians? What should Hawaiians get out of tourism if they're going to allow tourism to use the image or the stereotypes of Hawaiian whatever, that they've been doing for the last 150 years? What should that cost? And that's something that I'm rather depressed that hasn't shown up. That we had a chance, because otherwise I can guarantee by February or March, it'll be business as usual. And then they really want to, if they could, have 12 million people show up in 2021, which is going to impact us to a huge extent, because our actual numbers that we were supposed to have, that they thought was the maximum as of 15 years ago, was 8.5 million. That's what the Tourism Authority and everyone else said was the maximum the population here could handle, before you ended up with friction and dislocation and the population getting antagonistic about tourists. Right now, the discussion you hear in the media and from all the quote experts unquote is they really would like to have 12 million tourists next year. That doesn't include the Airbnb, which aren't tabled into that. So, this is one of the interesting episodes. The other episode, at least from an anthropological standpoint, is the new populations that have arrived and how they're going to adapt to life in Hawaii, since obviously this place has changed radically in the last 30 to 50 years, and how that's going to impact their ability to adjust. Micronesians are probably the most stereotypic of this, because they're the group that on one hand is being the most stereotyped here, but also in many ways I would argue they've been set up to fail by virtue of the relationship they had with the federal government, which never included in that discussion the state of Hawaii, the local population in here, so on. There was no attempt to make Micronesians an inclusive part of the system here. And I think, unfortunately, as a group now, they're paying the price for that. That was not their doing, but they're the ones that are going to pay for it. So the future here is equivocal. I do think that it's a different place, but I think that different place is based on a historical set of situations. As we move away from that, I don't think this place is going to be that different anymore. But I do think it has the potential to stay different if people actually collectively realize, for example, what being local means. And then my final point would be, at some point, I think the population has to decide if you have Hawaiians here, then what are locals? This was actually a thing back in about 20, 30 years ago, with the growth of Pigeon as an entertainment device, as everything else. Locals only was a big thing that you saw in a bunch of logo stuff. And so what you got was this idea that locals was actually sort of a group. In fact, you could argue in many ways it actually was an ethnic group, and probably maybe still is. But if that group's going to survive, it has to be cohesive enough, and they have to have discussions now with what I would say with the folks that consider themselves Hawaiian, because those two groups basically decide what's going to happen in this place. And if they can come together, or at least make a sort of collective idea of what that is, then a lot of these rest of these issues can be solved. They're not insurmountable, but they require collective agreement on identity, which I think could happen, but I'm not sure it's gonna. So that's my scenario for this semester in this class. Any questions or comments or other stuffs?